Alright, hi guys. So this is the first video for the digestive system chapter. And so in this video, we're going to do a lot of overviews of different parts of the digestive system because this is a very, very large chapter. So we're going to do an overview of the anatomy, overview of physiology, and an overview of histology in this video. And then in the videos that follow, we'll talk about each of the different parts of the digestive system in detail and how they work. Okay, so let's start our overview with an overview of anatomy. All right, and so with the digestive system, we divide it into the organs into two different categories. So they're either part of the alimentary canal or they're considered accessory digestive organs. So the organs that are part of the alimentary canal are going to be organs that food actively passes through, all right? So they're going to be basically a continuous tube, all right? And that tube is going to have an opening on the inside called a lumen, okay? So it's this continuous open tube, and then it's divided into different organs. So the function of this alimentary canal is to digest the food and to absorb the food into the blood, right? The different nutrients from food into the blood. So some of the organs that are included are going to be the esophagus, and so we can kind of point them out as we go through them, right? So this would be the esophagus. So that connects the oral cavity, all right, to our next structure, which is the stomach here. So you can see the stomach kind of tucked behind the liver there. All right, so food would move down the esophagus into the stomach here. And then from the stomach, it would move into, this would be the beginning part here, right, of the small intestine. Okay, and so then the small intestine actually continues to be this large mass of kind of tubular organs here that we see. Okay, and so then that is going to connect right here to the large intestine. All right, so we'll just point to the large intestine here. And so then that large intestine goes up, and then it goes over and down, all right? And then it connects to this area, which it would be the rectum, which then opens to the external area. Okay, so those are organs of the alimentary canal. So now let's talk about the accessory digestive organs, okay? So food does not necessarily pass through these. They don't necessarily have a lumen, but they help with digestion, all right? And so one of those would be the teeth, right? Obviously in the mouth. And then the tongue would be an accessory digestive organ. And then there's going to be several digestive glands that we'll talk about. So we have the salivary glands around the mouth that are going to make saliva, and saliva is going to contain some enzymes that are going to help to break down different nutrients in food. And then we have the liver, which would be right here. All right, and so the liver is going to not only make bile, which helps in digestion, but it'll also process the nutrients that have been absorbed from food. So the liver has quite a few really important functions related to digestion. And then lastly, we have the pancreas, all right? And so the pancreas is kind of this yellow organ here. If I were to kind of outline it, it's tucked a little behind here, right? It kind of looks like this. So that would be the pancreas. It's kind of tucked into the small intestine right here. All right, so the pancreas, we talked about with the endocrine system, makes insulin and glucagon, the hormones, but related to digestion, it actually makes a lot of really important digestive enzymes. And so it's going to secrete those digestive enzymes into the small intestine here that it's right next to. Okay, and so again, we'll talk about all of those in detail and their histology and the enzymes they make and how they function. All right. So now let's talk about our overview of the physiology of the digestive system. So what are all the functions that need to occur in the digestive system? Okay, so for physiology, kind of the overview purpose of the digestive system is for you to take in food, right? You're going to eat food. you're going to break it down. And so a large part of that breaking it down, that digestion, is going to occur through hydrolysis, all right? And hopefully you remember that hydrolysis is where you add water to break a bond. And that primarily in the digestive system is going to be done by enzymes. Okay? All right, so enzymes being proteins that help to catalyze reactions, right? Make them go faster. There are going to be lots and lots of digestive enzymes that we're going to talk about with this chapter. Okay, so let's review really quick the different macromolecules you learned about in A&P 1, because we're going to be talking about those a lot with digestion, because that's what we're going to be digesting and absorbing, are these different macromolecules. All right, so our first category is carbohydrates. And so hopefully you remember that carbohydrates, the most complex form of carbohydrate is a polysaccharide. All right. So this would be many simple sugars linked together. Examples of this would be starch. That in particular, starch would be the polysaccharide that is found in the foods you eat. So potatoes and that kind of thing are going to have a lot of starch. And then also there are some foods, especially plant matters, that contain cellulose. All right, and the storage form of glucose in the body, right, is going to be glycogen. That also is a polysaccharide. All right, and then there are disaccharides. So these are just two sugar, simple sugar molecules linked together, and we are going to talk about those. So through the process of digestion, we're going to take these complex polysaccharides, break them down into disaccharides, and then those disaccharides, the bond between those two simple sugars can be broken, and each simple sugar can be absorbed. Okay, so it's important to remember what those disaccharides are. All right, so the three that you learned in A&P 1 should have been sucrose, lactose. All right, so sucrose being the sugar and like granulated sugar that you use in baking, that you kind of keep in your kitchen at all times. Lactose being the sugar found in milk, and maltose being malt sugar. All right, so like the sugar in beer. If you've ever had like, you know, like a Whopper, right, with that malt flavor, or malt vinegar, right, that's maltose. Okay, and then lastly we have our monosaccharides. So we want our carbohydrates to be in monosaccharide form in order to be absorbed. All right, and so the most common monosaccharide we are going to talk about is going to be glucose, but then there's also galactose and fructose. All right, so those are monosaccharides. All right, and so monosaccharides can be absorbed in the digestive system. All right, so then our next category of macromolecule is going to be proteins. All right, and so there are lots and lots of proteins in the body, lots and lots of proteins in the food that we eat. And so proteins, the monomer of a protein is called an amino acid. And so your digestive system is going to have enzymes that are going to break down proteins, or, you know, strings of amino acids that are sometimes called polypeptides. So you may see that if you're reading something online. All right, that all a polypeptide is it's just a string of a bunch of amino acids. All right, so it's just like a polymer, a chain of amino acids. All right, or you can just say it's a protein. And the individual subunits would be amino acids. Okay, so amino acid would be the form that you could absorb in your digestive system. All right, and then lastly, we have our lipids. And so the lipid that's most important for this particular chapter is going to be a triglyceride, because that's the typical lipid that is going to be in your food that you're going to be absorbing from food. Okay, and so triglycerides, this subunits of a triglyceride, remember it has a glycerol backbone. All right, and it has 3 fatty acid tails. Okay, so 3 fatty acids. Okay, and so you would need to break down each of those triglycerides into its monomers to absorb them. And we're going to talk about in detail with triglycerides how that happens, because it's a little different than our hydrophilic molecules like carbohydrates and amino acids, because these are hydrophobic, right? They're fats, so they don't like water. They kind of involve a different process to be absorbed, and so we're going to talk about that in detail. Okay, so those are the nutrients that the digestive system is trying to absorb, in addition to lots and lots of water is going to be absorbed, different minerals, so ions are going to be absorbed, and vitamins as well are going to be absorbed. Okay, and then these are the other main nutrients. All right, so the stages of digestion. So these are kind of the different types of physiological processes involved in the digestive system. Okay, and so the first part of digestion is going to be ingestion. Okay, so this is just eating. All right, obviously this would occur in the mouth and involve the teeth and the salivary glands and the tongue, you chewing your food, right? So once you ingest food, you actually eat it, then you chew it up, and that's going to be mastication. So that also would involve your tongue, your cheek muscles, your teeth, getting it chewed up and ground down. And particularly important is that it's mixed with saliva. Okay, and so this process of chewing, here, right, is going to form what is called a bolus. Okay, and so the bolus is just this kind of ground up food mixed with saliva that, forms into kind of a soft ball of food that you can then swallow. So the point of chewing is to form food into a bolus that you can then swallow. All right, and so then swallowing is referred to as deglutition, and we'll talk about the process of swallowing and how it works. It's initiated in your mouth, right, by pushing that bolus to the back of your mouth, and then kind of the nervous system takes over from there. Okay, and then after you swallow the food, the main part of digestion begins. There is some digestion occurring when that food is mixed with saliva, because there's enzymes in that saliva, but the majority of digestion is going to occur after you swallow the food. Okay, and so digestion can be categorized as mechanical, and it can be categorized as chemical. So mechanical digestion is physically breaking down food, right? So that's like chewing food, using your tongue to kind of press the food against the roof of your mouth, that kind of thing. In your stomach, there's going to be a lot of churning, right? That's going to physically kind of crush up and mix the food as well. And so the purpose of this is that it's going to increase the surface area of the food. All right, so you want to increase that surface area so that when the enzymes are introduced, right, there's a major, like a large surface area for them to work on to break down all those chemical bonds between our different macromolecules. Okay, and so then chemical digestion would now be from hydrolysis by enzymes. All right, so that would be, just for an example, right, if we had maybe, a string of a few glucose molecules together forming a starch, right? We would just be adding, there'd be an enzyme that would add water to these bonds to break them. And so then you would end up with 3 separate glucose molecules that could then be absorbed into the bloodstream. Okay? So that's chemical digestion, and there are specific enzymes for each of those types of bonds that need to be broken. And so we'll talk about each of those as we go. And so remember that enzymes are proteins. And so they'll work in a very specific environment typically, all right, and under specific conditions. They also, like I said, will target specific bonds. So digestive enzymes, there would be a separate digestive enzyme. If we go back up and look at our disaccharides, right, there's actually a separate digestive enzyme for each one of these, right? So sucrose has an enzyme called sucrase that breaks that bond. Lactose has lactase, and maltose has maltase. So enzymes are extremely specific in the reactions that they catalyze, all right? And they can be reused. So an enzyme, so sucrase could break down one molecule of sucrose, move on to another one, break it down, and just keep going and going and going. Okay, so that's just a little review of enzymes from last semester. All right, so digestion, once those macromolecules are all broken down and digested into their single monomers, they can now be absorbed, right? So this has to be in monomer form. All right, for those macromolecules. The majority of the digestion is going to take place in the small intestine, particularly the majority of the small intestine that we saw on that picture. That's going to be the jejunum, is where absorption is going to occur. All right, so the whole point of absorption is to take all that good stuff from food, the water, those macromolecules, the vitamins and minerals, and to move them into the blood. Okay, and so from there, they can move, generally they're going to move to the liver. The liver is going to sort out what needs to be stored, what needs to go to tissues, and then from there they can go to the rest of the body. All right, and then the last digestive process is defecation. Okay, so the leftover material from the food is formed into feces, right? Lots of water is removed, and that feces is eliminated as waste. And so we'll talk about that at the very end of the chapter. Okay. So before we talk about histology, I want to talk about peritoneum for a minute. All right, and so there's several important membranes within the digestive system that we're going to discuss. And so peritoneum, just to review, peritoneum is made up of a serous membrane. And so serous membranes consist of simple squamous and areolar connective tissue, just like we've talked about the pleura. It was made of the same thing. And they secrete serous fluid, just like the pleura did. Okay, and so you can have visceral peritoneum, which is going to be on the surface of the organs. All right, so in this picture, that's going to be all of the green, right? So green means visceral in this picture. And then parietal is going to be the peritoneum that lines the wall of the cavity. And so in this picture, that's all going to be blue. Okay, and so then between those, we have the peritoneal cavity, and that is going to be full of that serous fluid. All right, so I'll just point to a little pocket here. All right, that would be, a peritoneal cavity region. There's lots of it, throughout here. All these spaces you kind of see, there would just be serous fluid in there. All right, so then hopefully you're noticing with this picture, right, we don't just have green and blue. There are also these purple structures. Okay, and so these are kind of unique with the digestive system. They're called mesenteries. And so there are these folds of serous membrane, all right, that kind of connect mostly in most areas, right? Like here, they're gonna, here we go, here. They're gonna connect the parietal with the visceral. All right, and so here, this little segment connects the parietal and the visceral. Here, we have parietal, and it's connected to the visceral here, all right, by this purple mesentery. The only exception kind of is this big fold here that's connecting between two visceral pieces. So we'll talk about that one as well. But generally, they're going to connect parietal and visceral. But they function as a pathway for lots of really important blood vessels and nerves throughout the digestive system. Also, they function for fat storage. So, for example, a lot of fatty tissue that can build up on the anterior part of your stomach would be deposited in this fold of mesentery here. And so it functions to provide a pathway for these things, as well as the fat provides some kind of padding and cushioning for the organ. And you can see it kind of also helps to anchor the organs in place. So they're not just kind of, you don't have the liver here just kind of floating down and around wherever it wants to go. It's anchored to the top of the abdominal cavity by this piece of mesentery. Okay, so very, very important are these mesenteries. So let's talk about each one because they have names that you should know. All right, so the first one is the falciform ligament. That's this one here. So it connects the diaphragm, right, the inferior side of the diaphragm to the liver. Okay, so the falciform ligament connects the diaphragm to the liver. And then below the liver, we have the lesser omentum. So that is right here. All right, and so the lesser omentum is going to connect the liver to the stomach below. All right, I'll actually write that just so because this is kind of a different view than you're used to seeing for the body, right? We're looking at more of a mid-sagittal section. So we have for falciform, it's the diaphragm, all right, to the liver. So then this would kind of be the base of the diaphragm here, right? This would be the liver here. And then the liver sitting on top of the stomach here. Okay, so that lesser omentum is going to connect the liver to the stomach. Okay. And then the greater omentum, right? So that's that kind of fold we talked about on the anterior part of the stomach. All right, so the greater omentum here, also called, how are we going to get this line here? So I'm not crossing lines later, right? So that's the greater omentum. Also called the fatty apron because, like I said, a lot of fat will tend to deposit in this mesentery here, right? And it kind of folds over in front of the mass of small intestines like an apron, kind of hangs down the front. So it's called the fatty apron. It actually connects from the bottom of the stomach, as you can see here, right? And when it folds back up, it connects to part of the colon here. All right, so it goes from the stomach to the colon. All right, and so we'll kind of look at that a little later, where it connects to each. When we talk about each of those parts, it'll be a little easier to see where it connects. Okay, and so then we have the mesocolon. And so the mesocolon connects the transverse colon. So the part of the colon that goes, remember in the picture, we'll just look at it really quick. Right, so the picture we were looking at for our overview, right, the large intestine goes up and then it goes over. This over part here, that's the transverse colon. So that's what we're looking at in the picture. So if we do a mid-sagittal section like this, right, that's what we're looking at. So we're seeing this transverse colon right here. Okay. So that mesocolon is going to be this piece here that's connecting the transverse colon to the posterior abdominal wall. All right. So the transverse, colon to the abdominal wall. All right, anchoring it in place. Okay, and then lastly, we have the mesentery proper, right? And this is actually one of the, to me, kind of the coolest things to see when you're doing a dissection in lab is this mesentery proper, right? And so that is this structure here, and it connects all of the small intestine, right? That winding small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. So it goes small intestine to the abdominal wall. And when you look at it with a dissection, right, and you kind of, if you're bold and you kind of start pulling some of these organs out, what you'll actually see is if you pull one of these pieces, these segments of the small intestine out, you'll see this, it almost looks like stained glass, right? It's transparent. It's this transparent membrane, but it's just full of these, like, honestly, really beautiful, like, blood vessels, kind of in this really beautiful pattern traveling through it. So I highly recommend, obviously we're online right now, but if you can, look up some videos or something like that of dissections, it's very cool to see that mesentery. All right. Okay. Sometimes it's surprising, when you're studying things in the human body, how beautiful kind of some things can be in the way that they're designed and arranged. I don't know if that sounds weird. That probably sounds weird, but if you see it, usually, students are kind of like, even if they don't like the dissection, they think that's pretty cool. Okay. All right. So that is our peritoneum. All right. And so now, let's talk about intraperitoneal and retroperitoneal first. And then we're going to talk about control of the GI tract. All right, so intraperitoneal versus retroperitoneal. This is how we're going to categorize different organs of the digestive system. So if an organ is intraperitoneal, it's completely surrounded by peritoneum. So if we look up here, right, we can see the stomach is obviously intraperitoneal. It's totally surrounded. So is the liver. All right, so are all of these segments here of the small intestine, the transverse colon, all of those are intraperitoneal. They're fully surrounded by peritoneum. However, you can have organs that are retroperitoneal, meaning they only have peritoneum on one side. So you can see here, all right, there's actually a segment of the small intestine called the duodenum or the duodenum, all right, that is only covered on this side by the peritoneum. So it's retroperitoneal. It's behind the peritoneum. Okay, and so one easy way to remember what organs are retroperitoneal, right? Everything else would be intraperitoneal, is with this mnemonic, right? So SAD pucker, SADPUCKER, SAD pucker. All right, and so I've written out for you what each letter stands for. So the suprarenal gland, this is the only one that's a little weird. I guess they, trying to get it to fit an S, right? This would be the gland that is superior to the kidneys, right? Renal meaning kidneys. This would just be referring to the adrenal glands. All right, so that's the adrenal glands. Okay, everything else should be a familiar term. All right, so the adrenal glands are retroperitoneal. The aorta is retroperitoneal. The duodenum, right, that we just mentioned, part of the small intestine, is retroperitoneal. The pancreas, the ureters coming off of the kidney going to the bladder. The colon, specifically the ascending and descending portions, all right, not that transverse portion, but those ascending, descending portions of the colon are retroperitoneal. The kidneys are retroperitoneal, the esophagus and the rectum are retroperitoneal. Okay, so practice that, and hopefully that mnemonic will help you remember which organs are retroperitoneal, because you should know each organ, is it intraperitoneal or retroperitoneal. Okay, so let's talk about control of the GI tract. All right. So control for the GI tract, it can be either, not either, right? It is actually both, controlled by the endocrine system and the nervous system. Okay, so the endocrine system is obviously hormones. We talked about that in our very first chapter. And so as we go through the digestive system, we'll talk about different hormones that are involved. This is what I want you to know for each of them, right? So where is that hormone released? Why was it released? What organ is it targeting, and what effect does it have on that target organ? Okay, so as we go, we'll point out those for each of the hormones we talked about. That's what you need to know for those hormones. So even if you maybe like make a digestive hormone list or something like that, and a lot of these hormones you'll have heard of because we talked about them in that first chapter. Okay, so that's the endocrine part. So now let's talk about the nervous system part. All right, so with the nervous system, it's going to be the autonomic nervous system. All right, you learned about this last semester. So the parasympathetic nervous system is that rest and digest part. Okay, so when it's activated, digestion is going to increase, movement of the digestive organs is going to increase, and secretion of those digestive glands are going to increase. And then parasympathetic is going to have the opposite effect. So it's going to decrease digestion, movement, and secretion. All right. So then there's also an additional branch. Depending on where you look, it's going to be included as part of the autonomic nervous system, but sometimes it's given its own totally separate category from the autonomic nervous system, but they do kind of work together. That's the enteric nervous system. And so this is actually a network of the nervous system that is in the GI tract itself. Okay, and it's going to consist of different chemoreceptors and stretch receptors in the different organs that are going to stimulate digestion and that kind of thing in response. So if the stomach, for example, is stretched because food has entered it, right, those stretch receptors can detect that and initiate digestion. Okay. All right. And then this system, the enteric nervous system, can be influenced by the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. Okay. So then our last topic for this video, we're going to do an overview of histology. Okay, and so this is going to be histology specifically of the organs of the alimentary canal. All right, not those accessory digestive organs, but the alimentary canal organs. And that's because they all have the same basic 4 layers in common. And then there's going to be, each one will have some variations within those layers that we'll talk about when we go through them. Okay, so let's talk about the 4 layers. All right, so the first one is the mucosa. Okay, so this is going to be the layer that's going to be closest to the lumen, right? So the inside of that organ. So if we're looking at this picture is our, histology, the mucosa would go from here, all right, to the bottom of this little pink layer here. So that's going to be the mucosa. Okay, and it's actually going to be blown up in this box here, right? That's what we've zoomed in on. So we've zoomed in on the mucosa here. Okay. So obviously the outermost cells on the mucosa, they're going to be epithelial cells. All right. And so typically in most of the digestive organs, that is going to be simple columnar. There will be stratified squamous in areas like the mouth and the esophagus where you're actually ingesting and chewing the food that could be abrasive or sharp. And so that adds a little extra protection. All right, but the rest of the digestive system is going to be primarily simple columnar. And then below that epithelium, all this yellow in this picture is going to be lamina propria. So it's going to be connective tissue full of nerves and blood vessels and lymphatic tissue as well. In very important lymphatic vessel, all right, is going to be a lacteal. And so that is this little green guy in here. So we're going to find out in some of the organs we talk about, right, they have these kind of like finger-like projections like we see on this. Okay, those are called villi. All right, and so within villi you have lacteals, and so lacteals are going to be really important for fat absorption from food. All right, because remember we said fat being hydrophobic goes through a special process for absorption. That's going to involve those lacteals, and so that's going to be in the lamina propria, right, of this mucosa. So all this here is lamina propria, and then along here that's our epithelium with our simple columnar cells, a lot of goblet cells as well there. Okay, and so then our next layer for the mucosa, our last layer for the mucosa, is this muscularis mucosa. And so that's here. So this is, I'm going to zoom in a little so we can see it a little better. All right, so this is a very thin layer of smooth muscle. Okay, so that's this layer here. Okay, so it's a thin layer of smooth muscle. It marks the bottom of the mucosa. And it's responsible for making these folds, right? Like these villi, for example, these folds of the mucosa. Okay, so when it contracts, that'll kind of squeeze that lamina propria and epithelium and make these folded structures. So that's the muscularis mucosa. Okay, so that's the mucosa. It goes from the epithelium down to the bottom of this muscularis mucosa layer. All right, so on this overview, we have our epithelium out here, and the bottom of this pink line, that would be the bottom of our muscularis mucosa. Okay, so then our next layer is going to be this kind of gray layer here, right? That's going to be the submucosa. There we go. All right, and so the submucosa is going to be a lot of areolar connective tissue. This is one particular layer that is going to be different between a lot of the organs. You're going to find different glands, depending on which organ we're talking about. You're going to find some lymphoid nodules, right? Those collections of lymphocytes in some of them. And then we also have important nerves here, right? So the the Meissner plexus, right? This kind of yellow we see here, all right, is going to be found at the base of the submucosa. And so that's going to be part of that enteric nervous system we mentioned. And it's going to be responsible for activating any glands that are found in the submucosa. All right, so the submucosa would be here and extending up, depending on the tissue, right? They may have some folds for the submucosa, they may not. But they're going to control the glands as well as the shape, right? If they have folds, it'll cause that shape because of the contraction of this muscle here. Okay, so that's the submucosa. And then our next layer, all right, is going to be our muscularis externa. Okay, and so that's going to include, all right, here we go, these two thick layers of muscle. And so if we look kind of where we're zoomed in over here, all right, there are two layers of muscle going in opposite directions of each other. So the innermost layer we refer to as the inner circular layer. All right, so in this picture, it's going to be going kind of away from us, versus the outer longitudinal layer is going to be going left and right. Okay, so you have two layers going in opposite directions, and they're going to be innervated by the myenteric plexus. Okay, so that's going to control these layers of muscle. Okay, and so they're going to be involved in moving food forward, mechanical digestion, right? The churning of the stomach, that is going to be this thick layer of muscle that's going to do that. All right, and then our last, fourth layer here, all right, that's going to be serosa or adventitia. Okay, so serosa would be if an organ is intraperitoneal, right? So it's completely surrounded by peritoneum. It's going to have serosa, so that's going to be a serous membrane around it. That's simple squamous with connective tissue. If it is retroperitoneal, it's going to be surrounded by adventitia. Okay. All right. So those are our four layers. So mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and then either serosa or adventitia, depending on which organ we're discussing. Okay, good. So one last little topic pertaining to that muscularis externa. All right, we mentioned that it's responsible for the movement of that organ. And so there's two specific types of movement that we could be talking about that you should really be able to differentiate between. It's extremely important. And so the first one is segmentation. Okay, so segmentation is random contraction of that muscularis externa along that organ. And so the purpose of this segmentation is to squeeze the food around and mechanically digest it, right? So segmentation in the stomach would kind of churn the food. There can be segmentation in the large intestine as well as the small intestine, where it's just kind of squeezing back and forth, squishing that food up, mixing it with enzymes, crushing it, that kind of thing. Versus peristalsis, which is a very coordinated, synchronized contraction of that muscularis externa, and its function is to move food forward. And so that's what we see, in this picture here, right? So here we're looking at peristalsis. So the muscularis externa would squeeze here above this bolus, right, in the esophagus to move it forward, right? As it moves forward, it would keep squeezing all the way down, right, as it's moving. Okay, so it's coordinated contraction all the way down to kind of push that food forward. I think of it as like a tube of toothpaste, right? So you squeeze all the way down to move that toothpaste out of the tube. Okay, so that's peristalsis. All right, so function of segmentation is for digestion. The function of peristalsis is to move food forward through that alimentary canal. All right, so we're going to stop there, and we'll pick up on the mouth for the next video.